I was 12 when my father threw me out for being gay. No coat, no shoes, just a torn duffel bag. The church bells rang while I walked away crying. 3 days later, I was sleeping on a bus station bench. Then a stranger in an army uniform sat beside me. He said one sentence that changed my entire life. 20 years later, my family would beg for my forgiveness. My name is Eli Grayson, and I grew up in Millbrook, Ohio, a town where everyone knew your business before you did. My father preached every Sunday. My mother baked pies for the church, and my sister Mara was the golden child who never made waves. Our house ran on rules. Pray before meals. Dress modestly. Never question Pastor Dale. And never, ever embarrass the Grayson name. I loved baseball and drawing, but what I loved most was a boy named Caleb who sat behind me in fourth period. I didn't have a word for what I felt, only a warmth that scared me every time Caleb smiled in my direction. My father, Robert, believed sin lived in soft voices and quiet boys, and he watched me like I might prove him right. My mother, Carol, noticed everything, but said nothing, hoping silence could smooth over whatever she suspected was wrong with me. Mara was 16, already dating the sheriff's son, already living the life our parents had drawn out for both of us. Millbrook had one stoplight, 2 churches, and a memory longer than any road, where secrets rarely stayed secrets for long. I started keeping a journal, writing Caleb's name in the margins, hiding my heart in pages I thought no one would find. Pastor Dale preached often about abomination and purity, and I sat in the pew memorizing every word like a warning meant for me. At night I prayed to stop feeling what I felt, terrified that God and my father agreed on exactly what I was. I told myself I could bury it deep enough that no one, especially my father, would ever have to know the truth. I was wrong, because journals get found, and 12-year-old hands aren't careful enough to hide what the heart insists on writing. My mother found the journal while doing laundry, and her face went the color of chalk when she read Caleb's name. She didn't yell. Mother studied and set it on his desk like evidence at a trial. I came home from school to my father waiting on the porch, journal in his hand, jaw tight enough to crack teeth. "Is this true?" he asked, voice low and dangerous, and I made the mistake of not lying fast enough. Mara watched from the staircase, frozen, her eyes begging me silently to deny it, to say anything but the truth. I nodded, because I was 12 and tired of pretending, and because some small part of me needed someone to know. My father's hand shook as he tore the pages out one by one. Like burning evidence could burn the feeling too. "Not under my roof," he said, and those 4 words felt heavier than anything I'd ever been told in my life. My mother cried into a dish towel in the kitchen. Not for me, but for what the neighbors might think come Sunday. Mara tried to speak up, but one look from our father sent her back up the stairs, silent and small. That night, I slept in my clothes, journal ashes still smelling faintly through the vents, waiting for morning like a sentence. I didn't know it yet, but that Tuesday night was the last time I'd sleep under the Grayson roof as their son. By morning, my father had already called Pastor Dale, and by afternoon there was talk of a camp that could fix me. I heard the word conversion through the heating vent and understood, even at 12, that my life was about to change forever. My mother packed a bag just in case, refusing to meet my eyes, as though looking at me made the sin visible. Mara slipped a $20 bill into my pocket that night, whispering "run" before our father caught her near my door. I didn't wait for the camp bus. I climbed out my window before dawn and walked toward the only place I knew, the highway. Millbrook shrank behind me as I walked, 12 years old, carrying nothing but a duffel bag and Mara's $20. I hitchhiked part of the way, lied about my age, and told strangers I was visiting an aunt 3 towns over. By the second night, hunger had become a physical ache, and the duffel bag felt heavier with every step I took. I ended up at the Millbrook Greyhound station, the only building lit past midnight. Benches cold under fluorescent lights. The station clerk eyed me twice but said nothing, used to runaways passing through on their way to somewhere else. I told myself I'd figure it out by morning. The way kids convince themselves problems solve themselves if you just wait. Morning came, and so did hunger, and so did a police officer who almost called it in before I begged him not to. I lied and said my parents were coming, that I was just waiting, and somehow my desperation was convincing enough to work. By the third day, I'd learned which vending machine sometimes glitched and dropped 2 bags of chips instead of 1. That's where General Thomas Reyes found me. Asleep sitting up, duffel bag hugged to my chest like a shield. He didn't wake me roughly, sighed me, and waited until I opened my eyes myself. "You look like you haven't eaten in days," he said. Not a question, just a fact stated plainly and without judgment. I told him I was fine, the automatic lie every runaway learns, and he simply nodded like he'd heard it before. He introduced himself as Tom, said nothing about the uniform folded in his duffel, nothing about rank or service, just a tired man. I later learned he'd retired as a 2-star general and now ran a small nonprofit for homeless veterans and displaced kids. He didn't ask why I'd run, and that question felt safer than any I'd been asked all week. Over eggs at a diner, he mentioned casually that his own brother had once run from home too, decades ago. I didn't understand the weight behind that sentence yet, only that his eyes went distant for a moment before he smiled again. He offered me a bed at the shelter he ran. No strings, no forms that night, just a mattress and clean sheets. I said yes because I was too tired to say anything else, and because his voice didn't carry the sound of judgment. The shelter was a converted church building, ironic given everything, filled with cots, volunteers, and no sermons about sin. For the first time in days, I slept without listening for footsteps, without bracing for a voice calling me an abomination. Tom checked on me every morning, brought me clothes that fit, and never once asked when I was going home. A week became a month. Filing paperwork I didn't understand. Paperwork with my name on it. I found out later he'd contacted Child Protective Services himself, worried what would happen if I vanished back into the system alone. He never pushed me to talk about my parents, but he listened every time I brought them up on my own. Slowly, I started calling the shelter's back office home in my head, though I never said it out loud to him. One evening he asked if I'd like to stay longer, officially, as his foster placement while things got sorted out legally. I cried for the first time since leaving Millbrook. Not from sadness, but from the strange relief of being wanted. That was the night Tom Reyes stopped being a stranger who fed me and started becoming the closest thing I had to family. Life with Tom found a rhythm I hadn't known was possible. School, chores, dinner together. No fear waiting behind any door. He never made me talk about being gay, but he never made me hide it either, which felt like its own kind of miracle. I asked him once about the brother he'd mentioned, and his face closed like a door before he changed the subject. I let it go, sensing some wounds needed more time than a 12-year-old's curiosity had any right to demand. Tom formally became my foster father that spring, and later, when the adoption papers were ready, my legal one too, I took his last name, Reyes, though I kept Grayson tucked somewhere inside me, unwilling to erase where I'd come from entirely. Mara wrote me one letter that year and signed. Just 3 words. I'm sorry. Stay safe. I read it 100 times. I didn't write back. Tact would find its way back to my father's temper. And I couldn't risk it. Tom taught me things my father never had patience for. How to change a tire. How to sit with silence. How to forgive slowly. He also taught me, without ever saying it directly, that a family could be built instead of just inherited by blood. By 14, I'd stopped flinching at raised voices. By 16, I'd stopped waiting for someone to tell me I was wrong. I thought Millbrook was behind me for good. I had no idea how many threads still connected me to that town. At 17, I finally let myself fall for someone, a classmate named Sam, gentle and steady in ways I hadn't known before. Tom met Sam over dinner and simply asked what college he wanted to attend. No lecture, no discomfort, just quiet acceptance. For the first time, being gay wasn't the headline of my life. It was just one true thing among many others. I threw myself into school, chasing a future in medicine, partly to prove something to a father who no longer got a vote. Tom came to every awards ceremony, every science fair, sitting proudly in folding chairs meant for parents, because that's what he was now. I got into a state university on scholarship, and Tom cried harder than I did when the acceptance letter arrived. College gave me distance from Millbrook's shadow, though some nights I still dreamed of my father's face when he read that journal. Estudied pyramid. Driven by something I couldn't fully name, maybe proving worth, maybe honoring the man who'd fed me that first morning. Sam and I stayed together through long-distance years, phone calls stretching past midnight, a relationship steady as a heartbeat. During winter break of sophomore year, an envelope arrived with no return address, cash inside, and a note that just said for tuition. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was Mara's, careful and slanted, the same hand that once wrote, "I'm sorry." I called the number scrawled faintly on the back, and she picked up on the first ring like she'd been waiting years. She told me she'd been sending money quietly since I left, working extra shifts, terrified our father would find the transactions. "I never stopped thinking about you," she said, voice breaking. "I just didn't know how to be brave the way you were." We started talking again in secret. Careful calls when our father was at church, rebuilding something neither of us had words for yet. Tom's health started slipping the summer I turned 20. Small things at first, a cough that lingered, fatigue that worried me. Doctors called it early-stage heart failure. Manageable, but serious. And suddenly the man who'd saved me needed saving in return. He waved off my concern, joking that generals didn't retreat from anything, not even their own failing hearts. I moved back closer to home to help manage his care, putting my residency applications on hold for a season. One night, exhausted and scared, he finally told me about his brother Daniel, the story he'd guarded for decades. Daniel had come out in 1974, and their father disowned him the same week, just like mine had done to me. Tom, only 19 then, had said nothing, too afraid of losing his own place in the family to defend his brother. Daniel died alone 12 years later, and Tom never got the chance to say he was sorry, or that he loved him. "I saw you on that bench," Tom said, "and I saw Daniel. I wasn't going to make the same mistake twice." It was the closest thing to an origin story I'd ever gotten, and it rearranged everything I thought I understood about him. I realized then that Tom hadn't just saved a stranger. He'd been trying to save his brother, 20 years too late. Tom had a biological son, Marcus, from a marriage decades earlier, a man I'd met only a handful of times. Marcus ran a real estate firm, resented his father's charity work, and resented me even more for existing in his father's will. "You're not blood," Marcus told me once, cornering me at a holiday gathering, "and blood is what actually matters in this family." Tom overheard and didn't raise his voice. Just said, "Family is who shows up. You should remember that before it's too late." The foundation Tom ran, the shelter that had saved me, was worth more than either of us had ever discussed openly. Marcus began pushing for control of it, framing Tom's illness as reason enough to intervene in matters he called financial responsibility. I told Tom I didn't want anything, that I'd never asked for money, only for the family he'd already given me. He squeezed my hand and said the foundation wasn't about money. It was about making sure no kids slept in a station again. Sam and I got engaged that spring, a quiet proposal in the same diner where Tom had once bought me eggs. Tom cried at our engagement dinner, calling it the first wedding in this family he actually wanted to attend. Marcus didn't come to the dinner, sending only a curt text wishing us luck, a coldness that stung more than I admitted. I finished my residency in emergency medicine. Driven by nights I still remembered spent hungry and cold on hard benches. Then, 3 months before my wedding, Tom collapsed at the foundation's office and was rushed into emergency surgery overnight. I sat in that same hospital waiting room where I'd once sat for strangers, except this time the patient was my father. Marcus arrived hours later, more concerned about paperwork than prognosis, asking about the will before asking about Tom's condition. The surgeon told us it was serious, that the coming weeks would determine everything, and I realized I might lose him too. Tom survived surgery but woke up weaker, the doctor's warning that stress could trigger another cardiac event without warning. Marcus used the moment to hire a lawyer, quietly questioning whether my adoption papers from years ago were fully, legally airtight. I learned about it from a mutual friend before Tom even knew, and the betrayal felt like déjà vu of my own father. I confronted Marcus, who shrugged and said, "Business is business. Nothing personal," a phrase that told me everything about his priorities. Meanwhile, back in Millbrook, Mara called with news I hadn't expected. Our father had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Stage 3. "He's asking about you," she said carefully, "though I don't think he knows how to actually say your name anymore." I felt nothing and everything at once. Grief for a relationship I'd buried years earlier, resurrected without my permission. Sam asked if I wanted to go see him, and I honestly didn't know, torn between old wounds and whatever remained of family duty. Tom, still recovering himself, told me from his hospital bed that regret was heavier than any grudge I could carry. "I never got to say goodbye to Daniel," he reminded me quietly. "Don't make my mistake into your inheritance, too." I drove to Millbrook alone, the same highway I'd walked as a boy, now paved smoother but somehow still familiar in my chest. The town looked smaller than I remembered. The stoplight still the only one. The church still the tallest building on Main Street. Mar met me at the diner first, hugging me so tightly I nearly dropped the flowers I'd brought without thinking. "He's different now," she warned me. "Sickness does that." Pastor Dale, older and grayer, stopped me outside the church, and I braced myself for another sermon about sin. Instead, he said quietly, "I married 2 men in this building last year, in secret, because love shouldn't have to hide anymore." I stared at him, stunned, as he admitted he'd questioned his own preaching for years, but feared losing his congregation's respect. "Your father's sickness changed something in this town," he added. "People started asking why we ever thought hate was holy." At the hospital, my father looked smaller than I remembered, tubes and machines replacing the booming voice that once terrified me. He opened his eyes, saw me, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. Decades of silence sitting heavy between us. "You came," he finally rasped, and I couldn't tell if it was relief or disbelief coloring his weakened voice. "Mara asked me to," I said honestly, unwilling to pretend this visit was purely my own forgiveness arriving early. He nodded slowly, then gestured toward a drawer, asking my mother to bring him something he'd apparently been keeping. Inside was a shoebox filled with newspaper clippings, my medical school graduation, an article about the foundation, my engagement announcement. "I kept everything," he admitted, voice cracking. I told myself I didn't care, but I read every single one, over and over. My mother, standing in the doorway, finally spoke too, admitting she'd mailed some of those clippings to him herself, secretly, for years. It turned out she'd never fully agreed with my father's decision, but fear of him, and of the church, had kept her silent. "I was a coward," she said, tears falling freely now. "I let you disappear because it was easier than fighting your father." My father reached for my hand, his grip weaker than I remembered, but the gesture felt like an earthquake in that small room. "I was wrong," he said simply. 3 words I'd waited 14 years to hear, finally arriving far too late, and yet still welcome. I didn't forgive him instantly. Some wounds don't close because someone finally says sorry, but something inside me softened anyway. Mara squeezed my shoulder, whispering that this was more than she'd ever expected our father to admit in 100 lifetimes. Back at Tom's hospital, Marcus's lawyer had filed formal paperwork challenging my adoption, citing incomplete documentation from years earlier. Tom, furious despite his weakened heart, demanded to see the paperwork himself, insisting nothing about that adoption had been incomplete. The hearing was set for 3 weeks later, colliding directly with the date Sam and I had chosen for our wedding. I split my days between wedding preparations and legal meetings, exhausted in ways that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. Sam kept me grounded, reminding me that whatever happened with Marcus, our wedding was still happening exactly as planned. Tom's lawyer uncovered something unexpected. The adoption paperwork Marcus called incomplete had actually been finalized months earlier than anyone remembered. A clerical delay, not negligence, explained the confusion, meaning Marcus's entire challenge rested on a mistake, not a real loophole. Still, Marcus refused to drop it, and I began to understand his anger ran deeper than money or paperwork technicalities. Tom finally admitted the truth. Marcus had grown up resenting how much time his father spent helping strangers instead of him. "He wasn't jealous of you specifically," Tom said. "He was jealous of every kid I ever helped who wasn't him." That reframing didn't excuse Marcus's cruelty, but it cracked something open, letting me see a wounded man instead of just a villain. I reached out to Marcus directly, asking to talk before the hearing, half expecting him to hang up immediately. He didn't hang up. Voice guarded, like a man bracing for an argument he'd already rehearsed. Meanwhile, my father's condition worsened rapidly, the cancer spreading faster than doctors had originally predicted just weeks earlier. Mara called, crying, saying the doctors didn't expect him to make it more than another week or 2 at most. I felt the ground shift again, grief arriving early for a man I hadn't finished being angry at yet. Sam offered to postpone the wedding, but I refused, telling him my father's choices shouldn't get to steal this too. Instead, I asked Mara if our parents could attend by video call, a small bridge between 2 worlds colliding at once. She agreed, promising to bring a tablet to the hospital room, whatever it took to make that moment possible. The night before the wedding, Marcus finally called, voice tired, admitting he'd withdraw the legal challenge before the hearing even started. "I don't hate you," he said quietly. "I think I just needed someone to blame for feeling replaced my whole life." I told him the foundation had room for more than one kind of son, if he'd ever actually want in. He didn't answer right away. But the silence felt different this time, less like a wall, more like a door left open. The morning of my wedding, I woke up with two feelings fighting for space in my chest: joy and dread. The wedding was small, held in the same church garden where Pastor Dale had once preached hellfire against people like me. Now he stood ready to officiate instead, robes replaced by a simple sweater, more nervous than I'd ever seen him. Sam looked at me like I was the only person in the garden, and for a moment, all the old fear disappeared. Mara sat in the front row, tears already falling, holding a tablet propped against a chair for our parents to watch. My mother's face filled the small screen, smiling through tears, whispering, "You look so happy," loud enough for the microphone to catch. My father's side of the screen stayed dark for a moment, and I assumed he was too weak to sit up and watch. Then, halfway through the vows, the garden gate creaked open, and a wheelchair rolled slowly down the aisle behind us. It was my father, four-pole and all, insisting the nurses bring him despite doctors' warnings that the trip could kill him. The entire garden went silent. Every guest turning to watch the man who'd once thrown his son out arrive to witness his wedding. "I wasn't going to miss this," he rasped, breathless from the effort. "Not again. Not one more time." Pastor Dale paused the ceremony, voice trembling, and asked if my father wanted to say anything before we continued. My father struggled to speak clearly, but the words came anyway. "I'm proud of you, son." I should have said that years ago. I felt something break open in my chest. Grief and joy tangled together in a way I hadn't known was possible. Tom, seated in the second row despite his own frailty, reached over and squeezed my father's shoulder. Two broken men understanding each other. "Thank you for finishing what I couldn't," my father told Tom quietly, voice barely above a whisper. "For raising him right." Tom nodded, unable to speak past the emotion, and for a moment the two fathers' eyes had simply held each other's gaze. Marcus arrived late, slipping quietly into a back row, uninvited but not unwelcome, watching the ceremony with an unreadable expression. Sam squeezed my hand, grounding me back into the moment, reminding me that today was still ours despite everything unfolding around it. Pastor Dale resumed the ceremony, voice steadier now, guiding us through vows written months earlier that suddenly felt more true than ever. "I do," I said, looking at Sam, at Mara, at my mother's face on the screen, at the father who'd finally shown up. The garden erupted into applause as Pastor Dale pronounced us married, sunlight breaking through clouds that had threatened rain all morning. My father, exhausted but smiling, asked to be wheeled closer so he could hug me for what felt like the first time in years. "I kept every clipping," he whispered into my shoulder, "because some part of me always knew you'd turn out extraordinary." Mara hugged us both, tears streaming freely now, whispering that this was the family reunion she'd stopped believing could happen. Marcus approached hesitantly afterward, offering an awkward but sincere congratulations, admitting he was glad he'd decided to come after all. "I dropped the legal challenge officially this morning," he said. "Figured it was time I stopped fighting people who never wronged me." Tom, overwhelmed by the day, quietly told me this was everything he'd hoped for when he'd first sat beside me on that bench. "Daniel would have loved this," he added softly, eyes wet, looking at the garden full of people choosing love over fear. My father's strength faded fast after the ceremony, and the nurses insisted on returning him to the hospital before evening fell. "I'm not scared anymore," he told me at the car. "Not of dying, not of what I used to believe. Just proud." I held his hand until the ambulance doors closed, unsure if I'd see him alive again, but grateful beyond words for today. 3 days later, Mara called at dawn, voice shaking, telling me our father had passed peacefully in his sleep overnight. I drove back to Millbrook one final time. Grief different this time, complicated but real. Mourning a man I'd only just gotten back. The funeral was held at the same church. Pastor Dale delivering a eulogy that finally, publicly, apologized for years of preached hatred. "I was wrong about a lot of things," he told the congregation. And Robert Grayson taught me that in his final months, the whole town showed up. Many faces I recognized, others new, all there to honor a man who'd changed at the very end. After the service, my mother handed me an envelope, my father's final letter, written weeks before he lost the strength to hold a pen. In it, he apologized fully, explained his fear of the town, of the church, of failing as a father in front of everyone. He wrote that watching me build a life anyway, without his help, had been the proudest and most humbling thing he'd witnessed. He left me the family house, the one he'd once thrown me out of, along with a note, "Fill it with love this time." Mara and I decided together to turn the old house into a small support center for LGBTQ youth from small towns like ours. We named it the Open Door, a quiet answer to the night my own door had been slammed shut behind me. Tom's health stabilized in the following months. The stress of the legal battle finally lifted. His heart steadier than doctors expected. Marcus started volunteering at the original foundation, slowly rebuilding a relationship with his father that neither of them had thought possible. Turns out, Marcus told me one afternoon, there's room in this family for more than one kind of son after all. I found out later that Tom had quietly funded a scholarship in Daniel's name years earlier, never mentioning it to anyone. It was for LGBTQ students pursuing medicine, the same field I'd chosen, a thread connecting Tom's grief to my own future all along. Sam and I moved into a small house near the foundation, close enough that Tom could still make it to Sunday dinners. Pastor Dale started an outreach group at the church, quietly welcoming families struggling the way mine once had, without judgment this time. Millbrook slowly became a different town. Not perfect, but softer, willing to admit its old certainties had cost real people real pain. Mara eventually left the sheriff's son, saying she wanted a life built on honesty instead of the appearances she'd been taught mattered most. She became the Open Door's first full-time director, finally living the brave life she'd always admired in me from a distance. On the first anniversary of my father's death, we opened the center's doors to its very first resident, a scared 15-year-old named Josh. I sat with him on the porch steps, the same way Tom once sat beside me on that bus station bench years ago. "You're safe here," I told him, and I watched something in his shoulders unclench, the way mine once had. Finally, Tom, now walking with a cane, but still sharp as ever, joined us on the porch, introducing himself simply as family. "If you want us." Marcus visited that weekend too, bringing groceries, no longer the man guarding an inheritance, just an uncle showing up for dinner. Sam took my hand as the sun set over Millbrook, and I realized the family I'd built outlasted every family I'd lost. 2 years later, Sam and I adopted our own son, choosing to build the very thing that had once been denied to me. We named him Daniel, after the uncle I never met, whose loss had somehow, decades later, saved my life anyway. Millbrook remembers me now not as the boy run out of town, but as the man who came back and rebuilt its door. I used to think family was something you were born into, but I learned it's something you choose to keep building. The Yindi.